We've got Rob Turner along today. Rob is going to be talking about a particular student. He's given him a false name, Mr. Gazami. And he'll be talking about this man learning to fly. Rob was a flying instructor with the Aero Club, did a lot of work here and became Deputy CFI and Chief Pilot. I won't give you much more of a background on Rob because I'm sure you're going to learn about his background as he talks. We might get him to talk about some other aspects of his aviation and other aspects of life at another time. So Rob, it's over to you.
How's that? Yeah, it's working.
Good.
That's great. Yes, Mr. Gazami was a name I'll give him. It wasn't his real name, and by the end of this talk I think you'll appreciate why I've given this gentleman a different name. It's about his first solo flight. Just to go back in time a little bit to the mid-1980s, first of all I was an instructor here from 1979 till 1989, and during that time the Aero Club had gone through a tremendous time of increasing its flying hours. Way back in the early 1970s, I think, or late 60s, the club was on the verge of being dissolved. They were just going nowhere. John Douglas came down from Narrogin, turned that around, and by the time this flight took place, the Aero Club was booming. We were flying about 3,000 hours a month, 36,000 hours a year, and that took some doing. There was about 18 or 19 full-time instructors on the staff and a couple of part-timers. The club was using for its basic training the Cessna 152 aircraft. I think two that this gentleman flew, I think they're still on the line to this day, 30 years later. They were very, very good training aircraft, and they had to be for this student. They really did. And I first came to hear about Mr. Gazami. I was Deputy CFI at the time, and I heard the instructors in the old Aero Club downstairs talking about this Japanese student that they had, and it seemed that everyone would fly with him once and never again. And it reached the stage where there was no one left to fly with him. And because of my position, I thought, well, I better do a flight with him and assess the situation and see where we go from there. And I did that, and I got a bit of a shock. Well, just to tell you a little bit, first of all, about Mr. Gazami, he was a Japanese gentleman, and he was not a young student as I thought he was. He was 72 years of age. He'd sold his business in Tokyo for $16 million, he told me later. It was a manufacturing industry making parts for cars, very, very successful. He'd retired on selling that business and come down here with his wife, bought 2 little duplexes overlooking the ocean at North Beach, and he had a dream. He wanted to learn to fry, as he put it. Well, I tell you what, he tried hard to do that. He had a problem. He had no coordination. Time and time again, I'd sit there in the cockpit with him thinking, why don't you take up a hobby more suited to your coordination skills, something like sunbaking or watching the tide come in? But he'd just turn and look at me and say, I want to fry. The staff here at the time, we flew hard to keep ours up, and we partied hard. Some of you might recognise a couple of faces there. You might remember Greg Wilson, Rod Duncan. Who's that?
Robinson.
Di Robinson. John Engel. John was always, while I was here, he was always a part-time instructor, dressed as a girl there, suited him well. Glenn Capel over there.
You still see him looking like that?
Well, we went out to the training area with Mr. Gazami, and that one's come on a bit early actually. But I had to write out the instructions from Mr. Gazami in his little notebook. I'd write them in English on the right-hand side of the page. He'd very laboriously, before the flight, transcribe them into little houses and barbed wire on the left-hand side of the page. And he'd refer to that during flight. His English was absolutely atrocious initially. It took about 3 goes of a sentence just to get 2 or 3 salient points across to him. And we went out to the training area, and after about 20 minutes, I devised some definitions that adequately described his flying standard. There you are, a reference point, a place on or near the horizon that could never be headed towards. Altitude, a number on the altimeter to pass through on the way to some height he was trying to avoid. straight and level flight, that 5-second prelude to a spiral dive. These are not made up, I can assure you, they were dead true. Climbing is what happens in straight and level flight. Descending, what happens in straight and level flight, only quicker. And turning, an uncontrolled change of direction towards nowhere in particular. Very hard to teach a person like that to fly. As soon as his hands went on the controls, it was sort of hand on the control column, hand on the throttle, and he'd go into a spasm. It'd be like that. And he'd freeze. And of course, while he was freezing, the aeroplane did what it wanted. Well, we did hours and hours in the training area and really got nowhere. All he could do every time he came back, asked me, to go up with him again because he wanted to fly. Eventually I thought, look, I'll put you into the circuit area. At least there'll be a definition of why we turn, why we fly straight and level, etc. So we started doing circuits. I should say at this point that his radio calls were quite humorous. Going to the training area, it was always going to the turning area, not training area. And the first flight he ever did with one of the instructors was information echo, because that was the terminal airport information code on that day. So it didn't matter whether it was Alpha, Bravo, Charlie or whatever. Every time he flew, it was with information echo. And he didn't know the difference. Downwind calls, when we started circuits, was Romeo Whiskey Yankee, down window, touch and glow. I didn't mind the touch too much, but I wasn't too fussed about this glow business. The guys in the tower got very used to him. They started calling him and referring to him as Mr. Kamikaze. And I tell you what, there was reason for that too. I'll try and find another slide here. This was Jandakot in his day, no dual runways. That's a normal circuit that people might fly with his legs. This is a good circuit that Mr. Kazami would fly. Sometimes downwind leg there would be a great big semicircle. Other times it would be a short cut through to the keyboard on the approach to landing. Initially he couldn't hold altitude within 400 feet. We used to fly early mornings and lunchtime so that we could do it when there was no traffic in the circuit area. The tower were very, very good about it. One downwind leg I remember fairly early in the piece. I headed him up onto a reference point at the end of downwind leg and I said, "You fly, me sleep." And I thought by saying that, he might keep himself alive for a little bit longer. Now he was always in the habit from the first day I flew with him, when the aircraft got out of control, i.e. after about 5 seconds, he'd start going, woo, 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 like this. So here's me in the cockpit alongside him, give him the reference point, you fly, me sleep. I shut my eyes and I started counting to 10. Pretty quickly, I'm not that brave. And I got to about 6 or 7 and the hooting started. And I kid you not, I opened my eyes and whereas Canning Vale Prison should be down there on the right-hand side, I looked up and there's a plan view of Canning Vale Prison coming into the front windscreen. I can assure you I've never been in prison in my life before, but I came damn close that day, albeit posthumously. But the standard got better and better and better. His English improved and eventually he could hold altitude within about 150 feet and we'd get to the end of downwind leg somehow. He could get the flaps down and he'd make his approaches to land. That again started a new facet of training to get him to reach the keyboards. Very often he'd reach the ground out about here somewhere, 300-400 metres short. Other times he'd reach the keyboards okay, but they were at the wrong end of the runway. 2 or 3 times we missed the runway completely, but when there was a slight crosswind, which I tried to avoid, it was better off in teaching him to hold off and flare, just to avoid the crosswind. And if we drifted over the grass, that's where we landed and took off from. I quite enjoyed it, frankly, but I don't like to tell people that too much. Yeah, there were some beautiful radio calls came from the tower. The guys from the tower used to come down to the old bar downstairs occasionally and have a drink, and we'd have a great laugh about the antics that happened. And two radio jammers came out. The first one when he was on downwind leg, and he just suddenly went into a dive quite steeply and speared towards the ground on mid-downwind. And the tower came on the radio and said, Romeo Whiskey Yankee, you still intending to land at Jandakot? There's another runway over there that we don't know about. And another time there, when after about three requests to turn onto downwind, and I kept prompting him to do so, and the tower came on and they said, Romeo Whiskey Foxtrot, are you wondering, Romeo Whiskey Foxtrot, we're just wondering here if you're continuing with circuits or are you commencing NavX 1? But he continued on and we persevered and persevered, and the day came about 18 months after I first started flying with him. Not a breath of wind, not a cloud in the sky. It was beautiful, and he went out and he flew quite good circuits. 8 o'clock in the morning, we flew again at just before lunch, and another 4 or 5 beautiful circuits, a few bounces here and there, but who cares? And for some reason, I don't know why, we pulled off the runway, and I said to him, I'm going to send you solo. To this day, I don't know why I did it, but I am glad I did. I gave him the usual brief. I better change. We were sitting in that taxiway there, and I said to him, you're going to go solo, 1 circuit. And just at that point, a little 152 from the Aero Club taxied up to the holding point, and I asked the tower if that aircraft was going to do solo circuits or training area, and they said no, he's doing circuits. So I said to Mr. Kazami, you follow that aeroplane. Well, I got out, he taxied up to the holding point, I'm standing at about that point, and I watched him taxi up and get behind this other aeroplane, and a couple of minutes later the first aircraft took off, and just as it did, another aircraft taxied out and took off from this intersection. I don't know why the tower gave him an intersection departure. He took off and made a right-hand turn out to Fremantle. 30 seconds later, my pilot is on his tail flying to Fremantle. He disappeared from view. I reckon I hold the record from running from the town to the Aero Club. I ran as fast as I could and jumped into the first aircraft I could find and got on the radio to the tower, who said we've lost sight of him and he's not answering the radio. 5 minutes went by, 10 minutes went by. No, I thought he was dead. I didn't know what I was going to tell Frank Zanetti and those guys in the police force. Anyway, the minutes kept ticking by, and eventually John Douglas was coming back from the training area, and he was told to orbit overhead and keep a lookout and monitor things. And eventually, this little spot appeared in the sky and made its way towards Jandakot. Mr. Kazami later told me that he got somewhere out over the ocean and he got confused because Jandakot, as he called it, changed places with the sea. He flew circles between Rottnest and Fremantle for quite a few minutes, sorting himself out, and then came back to Jandakot. He got himself on the downwind leg. The fact that it was a completely different runway to the one he'd taken off from is quite incidental to this story. He got onto downwind leg for runway 30, and he turned base and came down, lined up on finals, would have been fairly good. He flared and held off. He was about halfway down the runway or more by this stage, and it would have been a good landing if the ground had been close, but it wasn't. I think the lighter aircraft confused him for a first solo, and he held off, and then the airplane just finished flying and fell about 20 feet, bounced around a bit, stayed on the runway, and came to a halt about 20 or 30 metres in the gravel off the end of the runway, just out there. And I was so relieved he was back on the ground, you know, it was incredible. Well, he taxied in, and I walked over to the aircraft, and he got out with a grin on his face from ear to ear. He was so pleased, and I congratulated him, and then the grin disappeared and he became very serious, and he poked me in the chest and he says, "Wob, now you must give me my private pirate license." Well, that was Mr. Kazami's solo flight, and the story should end there, but it doesn't quite. The next lesson he booked for the Saturday dinner time, and he didn't arrive. An hour later, I had a telephone call come through to me, and it was his Japanese housekeeper who spoke fairly good English and said, Mr. Kazami has been involved in a crash on West Coast Highway as a result of his having a massive heart attack, and he died in his car. It was a great relief to me, despite the circumstances of his dying, because he couldn't have gone solo again, not for many, many hours. The reason, I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, his reason for learning to fly was to fly around the world and talk about world peace to as many leaders in as many countries as possible. And what a wonderful thing to do. He wanted to do that in a tin-engined aeroplane. So that was a bit of an impossibility on its own. But I was very proud to have taught Mr. Gazami. I was invited to read the eulogy at his funeral, and afterwards I presented his wife with his flying logbook. It had 147 hours of dual instruction and almost 3/4 of an hour solo for his first solo flight. And that was Mr. Gazami's solo flight. I think it's a story worth telling, and thank you for listening.